Second announcement, there's been a little change in the program because we've had a delay on some of our 115 speakers. And so we're going to go to the 220, which is role of the trainer in racehorse and safety. And there's also been a change in that panel because that was a panel discussion with Ed Bowen moderating and Graham Motion and Tim Gleishaw here as the trainers, but Tim Gleishaw, as fate would have it, had a horse colic this morning, so he didn't make it. So it's essentially going to be a Q&A with Ed Bowen and Graham Motion. So I think all of you know Ed Bowen, but I still think he should be introduced because oftentimes we take Mr. Bowen for granted as just always being around and just being the guy, but a lot of people don't know what his background is, so I would like to introduce him. Since 1994, Mr. Bowen has served as full-time president of the Grayson-Jockey Club Research Foundation. Prior to joining the foundation, Bowen was a journalist covering horse racing for 30 years. He's quite a historian. Primarily, he worked with the Blood Horse, where he served as managing editor and then editor-in-chief. He's the author of 20 books on thoroughbred racing, and you'll be glad to know there's a 21st book in the works, and it's on the Triple Crown. He was already working on that book prior to this year, so there's been some updates that have had to be made, and so that's delayed production a little bit. He's also a past president of the Thoroughbred Club of America and is currently a vice president of the National Museum of Racing and Hall of Fame, as well as president of the American Academy of Equine Art. So he's well-rounded and very well qualified to lead the Q&A with trainer Graham Motion, and I will let Mr. Bowen introduce Graham Motion, so please welcome Mr. Bowen.
Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to have a distinguished horseman, Graham Motion, with us. The other participant in this panel was Tim Gleishaw. He called with his apologies. He's treating a filly for colic, and since we're all about the safety of the racehorse, I couldn't very well say, well, sorry, we have a deadline too. So we understand that he's taking care of his horse, which is what we all want them to do. Want all horsemen to do. And Mr. Motion is very distinguished. I won't go, once you've said he's won the Kentucky Derby, that qualifies him. He also had a wonderful horse, Better Talk Now, whom you probably remember winning the Breeders' Cup Turf. And he's just a very, very successful, well-rounded trainer. He operates at Fair Hill in New York, in Maryland, and he has a great frame of reference. He'll be able to talk in terms of how American racing is conducted, how English racing is conducted. He has a background throughout his life as being around horses, good horses, and very, very good horsemen. And it's a pleasure to welcome Graham Motion. Now, is this working, Donna? Okay, good. Well, Graham, thank you very much for coming. I appreciate your working this into your schedule with flying in and out today. Earlier this morning, the report on the equine injury database made the point that there is a small increase in risk factor that's associated with the horse changing trainers. And I wondered if you could just sort of talk us through, I don't know how often it happens in your career anymore, but when you have a horse that has been campaigning with another trainer, the horse comes to you, what information do you want? What's most important for you to know? And is that information usually fairly available to you?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me. Thanks for introducing me, and it's a pleasure to be here. You know, I think it's something that happens more and more for trainers these days, where horses tend to move around perhaps a lot more than they used to. And I think, by and large, when through private purchases or owners changing trainers, mostly the exchanges between the trainers are very good. I think more often than not, everyone's very forthcoming about any issues the horse might have. Certainly, if we send a horse on to another trainer, we like them to know, what they may or may not be dealing with. And I think people are very, on the whole, I think people are very aware of that. In Maryland, I know for a fact that when a horse is claimed now, you're required to give vet records for the previous 30 days, and this could well be in other states. I'm not exactly sure which states that's pertinent to, but in Maryland, that's a rule. So after a horse is claimed, you will then turn over any vet information, vet records you have, so that the new trainer now is aware of what may or may not have been the horse may not have dealt with in the last month, which I think is tremendous. I think we're so much more aware of injuries and trying to avoid injuries than we used to be. I think it's a very good thing.
Thank you. Of course, keeping in mind, as a journalist, my instinct is to say, gosh, this guy won a Kentucky Derby. I want to hear all about that. But the thrust of this is to get Mr. Motion's insights into how trainers can, what they can do to promote the health and safety and soundness of the horse, while always, of course, training them to the best of their ability. With that in mind, in recent years, as the tremendous strides have been made by Thoroughbred Aftercare Alliance and other organizations, we've become more and more interested and successful, I believe, in conditioning horses, ex-race horses, for other careers. And that puts a premium on the trainer of the racehorse making a very astute decision as to when to stop on that horse and let him have a chance, or her have a chance, for the next career. Can you talk about some of the things that would weigh on that decision, both from your own standpoint and thinking back perhaps to earlier days when maybe you had horses that were more marginal, if I can use that phrase? What are some of the things that you would admonish or suggest to a trainer for helping make that decision to not push for one more race, but to go ahead and make this horse available to do something else?
I mean, I'd much rather talk about the Kentucky Derby, but it seems like a long time ago. Again, I'd like to think that we, as an industry, have become so much more aware of when horses should be retired and, how many careers, how many opportunities are available to them when they have retired, which I think makes our jobs a lot easier because placement, whether it's through the retirement homes, through the many organizations that will help place horses, I think it's become much more aware to the owners as well as the trainers to replace horses, rehome them, if you like, whether it's for a serious professional career. We had a horse several years ago called Ichabod Crane, who was a real barn favorite of ours, and as he got to his, I believe, 7-year-old year, he'd actually been third in the Preakness as a 3-year-old. He'd gone on and won quite a few New York bred stakes and kind of became a pretty well-known horse in the area and one of our favorites. We started a relationship with Philip Dutton. In our area in Maryland and Pennsylvania, we're fortunate that we have a lot of people that do 3-day eventing, show jumping, hunting. So we have a lot of outlets for horses. And Philip took over Ichabod Crane with the idea that he could possibly compete on him. Philip's extremely demanding and picky about what he takes, which I've found through the years when we've asked him to take on other horses. But he really took a liking to Ichabod Crane and went on to win the first thoroughbred makeover on him, which was extremely gratifying for us. And I think at the time it brought a lot of attention to it. And I give my wife the credit because it was her idea and she's become very passionate about it. He actually recently, they've I guess you would say, made a Breyer horse in his replica, and they're introducing it here in a couple of weeks. Unfortunately, Ichabod Crane was supposed to go, but he was kicked in the paddock a couple of weeks ago and sustained a tiny fracture in a hind leg, so he won't be able to travel, but he's going to be fine. But that's sort of the ultimate result of what can be done, and I think it's brought attention to it. I think the Thoroughbred Makeover has been tremendous in giving us options and for people having the idea of what they can do with horses. I guess I'm getting away from the point of when you should know when to stop on a horse. You know, I think as a trainer, one of the hardest things we have to deal with is we are frequently dealing with passing on bad news to owners. And I think from a trainer's perspective, you have to get over the fact that, you know, horses are going to get hurt and it's not your fault. So, you know, don't be afraid to pass on this information. And when you feel a horse has had enough, whether it's through injury or not wanting to race anymore, you know, you have to know when it's time. And I think I've recently had this with a horse called Rafting, who's been running very well earlier this year, and I haven't thought he was as sound after his last race as he normally was. And, you know, fortunately, I'm dealing with the Wertheimers, who are very quick to decide that it's time to stop. It's time to find another career for him. So, look, every trainer it's different, every owner it's different relationships, but I think we're much more conscious of it now than we used to be, perhaps.
Well, recently you were in perhaps an unusual circumstance where you were running Irish War Cry on a very hot, sultry day, and you made reference to your concerns. Can you just sort of talk us through the fact that you have a horse who, I'm not talking out of school, I don't think, since you made comments about him, and that balance between obviously wanting to utilize this horse's terrific abilities and protect him. Can you sort of talk us through that experience, if you're comfortable with it, maybe?
No, I am. I mean, I've been fairly open about it. You know, we were fortunate. You know, I had a suspicion after we were running in Gulfstream this winter that his career is very checkered. He either runs extremely well or extremely poorly. And it's taken us probably longer than perhaps it should have to realize that he had an electrolyte imbalance. When he ran in Florida the last time, he had a condition called the thumps, which is very debilitating. And it's probably something that I had not rationalized how significant an issue it is for a horse to deal with until this particular horse, and I'm now very aware of it. He came back and ran at Pimlico on a very cool day in a situation where it really helped him, without a doubt. His two biggest performances were at Pimlico on a very cool day and Aqueduct in March, April. It's not a coincidence that those are probably his two best performances. I regret running him the other night, to be honest. I was upset with myself. Hindsight's 20/20, but I really felt that it was going to cool off that night once the sun went down. I was there myself because I wanted to make the decision, and I just think I underestimated how hot it was, and it just never cooled off, and he really struggled with it.
Graham, I want to interrupt just for a point of clarity, because I don't think everybody here knows about the race. So he ran in the Stephen Foster the other night at Churchill Downs. It was a race that we covered on NBC Sports Network. Fortunately, we had decided through the NTRA and Breeders' Cup also to implement a kind of a Racing 101 educational piece into all of these Road to the Breeders' Cup races. And fortunately, the thumps and the electrolyte imbalance that Irish War Cry had sort of experienced throughout his career was what we decided to touch on that day. So before the race, we had educated our audience about it, and then he was pulled up out of the race, 100% sound, walked onto the van, just didn't finish the race. But I don't know his condition after the race. We'll let Graham comment on that. But it was about 86 degrees at about 9 o'clock at night when he ran, which is something that you certainly couldn't foresee when you entered him. And so I just wanted that clarification for people who weren't familiar with the horse in the race. And please continue.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And it is a touchy subject to talk about, but I think it's important that people realize the decisions are difficult ones to make, especially when you've already entered a race and when you're already there and getting ready to go to the paddock. And it's very easy to make these decisions after the fact. Horses can't talk, and ultimately That's the problem we have. You know, any coach has an athlete comes off the field and says, "Coach, I'm done. You know, I can't play anymore. My leg's killing me. You know, I can't catch my breath." But with horses, as trainers, we have to make that assumption. We have to figure out we are there to protect them. There's no one else that can do that. And I think that becomes a tremendous responsibility. I take it very seriously, and I do kick myself for running the other night. I think I put him in an awkward situation. I felt he would be able to deal with it, and he wasn't. And unfortunately, that's a learning curve. It's very hard to look in a crystal ball. But the good news is the horse is absolutely fine. He won't run again this summer. We'll wait till the fall for a cooler day.
Thank you. Thank you. I remember a few years ago, Dr. Larry Bramlage used the phrase to me that what is optimal training for the cardiovascular system of a horse, of a racehorse, is not the same as what's optimal for the musculoskeletal system. First, is that something that you agree with? And B, if you do agree with it, how do you reconcile that? And is it something that's on your mind much or not?
I think it's constantly on your mind. I mean, I think as a trainer, you're constantly worried about the well-being of the horse. Certainly I am, whether it's racing, training in the morning. You know, when a horse first comes back to me after a layoff, after a break, if you like, there's a very fine line between getting it fit and not doing too much with the horse, so you're putting him in a tough position. I think that's what you're referring to. So without a doubt, I think most of our time is spent as a trainer trying to find the balance of not overexerting a horse, but at the same time you have to get them fit. And it also comes back to the whole thing of, you know, horses can't come back and say, "I did too much today, boss. You know, I'm not ready for that." I wish they could. It would make it a whole lot easier. But we have to be able to figure out what's too much and what's enough. And there's a very fine line that you balance all the time.
Well, that reminds me of another statistic. I don't remember if Dr. Parkin mentioned it this morning, but another indication of the use of the equine injury database. Again, these are not big dramatic changes, but just small risk factors. And that is a horse coming off a layoff. There is a blip up for injury in the second start back. Would you think that maybe that indicates that the trainer is maybe, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but anyway, do you think that might be a warning that maybe your trainers are thinking the horse is ready to come back just a bit before he is?
I mean, I think from my own experience, the second race back for a horse is the most difficult race. Because either you've run a horse the first time that's fit enough, or if it runs for the first time and it's a little short, but it overexerts itself and it's able to win the race anyway, I think it can be quite debilitating. Maybe debilitating is the wrong word. It can really knock a horse out for a while, and I think it's the biggest mistake I think I have made in the past as a trainer is trying to come back too quick with a horse second time off a layoff. Because the first race can often knock them out. Now, I always remember Alan Jerkins talking to me about it once, and he said, well, yes, that's fine, but if they're fit enough the first time, it won't knock them out. So, again, I think you're balancing a fine line. I think I'm always trying to be patient and not run a horse too quickly. You know, if you think they might need one more work, they probably need a couple, you know. Whether, you know, that translates to injuries, I'm a little surprised that would correspond, but certainly from a fitness point of view, I often find that second race is a difficult race to figure out. And I think frequently when I watch other trainers, I'll see if a horse runs a huge race off a layoff, often that second race back is not nearly as good an effort.
All right, good. Again, I want to emphasize that when I say an increase in risk factor, they're tiny increases, but you know, perhaps worth thinking about. Well, another aspect that key to the reports of the equine injury database is the somewhat, I guess, noticeable differences in safety relative to the artificial surfaces, dirt and turf. could you just sort of discuss your experiences with that subject and any conclusions, either tentative conclusions or firm conclusions that you've come to?
Yeah, I mean, it's something I feel fairly passionate about. We're fortunate enough at Fair Hill to have 3 surfaces we can train on. We have a synthetic, a Tapeta synthetic. We have a dirt track, which was recently renovated last year, I believe. We changed it at Fair Hill. And we also have a turf course, which is also the Maryland steeplechase course, which we can use several times a week as a turf workout, to take horses over there for turf workouts. I find I do most of my training on the synthetic. I'm a huge fan of synthetics. I think most people that follow me would know that. I've tended to be outspoken about it. I was very disappointed that they had such a short career, except for a few tracks now that still have them, including Woodbine and Presque Isle, where I race quite a bit. I strongly believe, from my experience, I had less injuries when we were racing on a synthetic track. I think people tend to pick up on other injuries that come about because of a synthetic track, but I think they forget about the injuries they're not seeing that they might have seen more of when they were training just on the dirt. I think there's a big use for synthetic tracks, even if it's not necessarily as a sole racing surface. I think it should be used as an alternate surface, perhaps when on rainy days when races come off the turf, it gives you a tremendous option. 90% of the time, if a race came off the turf, I would run on a synthetic track rather than a nasty, sloppy track where I think I would have more chance of perhaps having an injury for a horse that's not familiar with running on the dirt. I think as a training surface, it's a great opportunity. So I think it's a shame. I know there's been talk about possibly putting a synthetic track in New York, and I think it would be a huge asset because I think they do have a place in our industry for that very reason, that I think horses tend to come up with less injuries on them.
Does that lead you to thinking about any particular horse that you change surfaces with and maybe like went from synthetic to dirt one day? Does that anything come to mind there?
Yeah, so Animal Kingdom was the first horse to ever win the Derby in his first start on the dirt, and the only horse, I believe, to have done that. So, I had actually trained him mostly on the grass over the winter when he came to me, and had felt that he was more of a grass horse. If anyone had asked me in April, or perhaps that's unfair, perhaps March of his 3-year-old career, that he would have won the Kentucky Derby, I would have said you were crazy. So he won on the grass. He actually was finished second, I believe, at Gulfstream on the grass. We had the idea of, possibly pointing him for the Derby. I believe he'd won on the dirt here at Keeneland for his previous trainer. So we had the idea of, making a transition to the synthetic, using it as a Derby prep. So we went to Turfway. He was good enough to win that race. And then Barry Irwin and I made the decision that if he worked well at Churchill over the dirt, that we would take a shot in the Derby. And I think it was one of the wet, it seems like it's always wet here in the spring, but it was definitely a very wet couple of weeks. We finally got him over to Churchill the week before the Derby, and he had an exceptional workout. I remember everybody saying, well, Baffert said that horse is the horse to beat. So I was like, well, that's got to be good. We're good after his workout. So, and he only ran, after that, he ran on the dirt in the Preakness, where he was kind of unlucky, second, I thought. And then he actually got injured in the Belmont, and those were his three dirt tries as a 3-year-old. The World Cup was on a synthetic. When he finally got to the World Cup 2 years later, that was on a synthetic surface. So, look, I think ultimately really good horses can handle any surface. I think when you look back in history, good horses have handled any surface. Thanks for letting me talk about him.
Good. Well, by and large, in horses who are not with the Kentucky Derby in your mind, obviously when you switch surfaces, you are looking to utilize the horse in a better way. What are there situations where you? What are some of the aspects that lead you to switch surfaces and clearly you're only doing it because you think it's not going to increase the danger to the horse, but what are some of the things that go into making the decision? I always think in terms of Saratoga, there's a number of trainers who will switch a horse to the grass. What are some of the things that go into making that switch? Is it experimental in most cases, or are you pretty confident from workouts that you're making a good move?
I mean, it's a good question. I think a lot of the times it is experimental. I mean, I had a horse recently called Spring Quality who won the Grade 1 Manhattan on the Belmont undercard. He was a horse that was by Quality Road. I felt that he handled the dirt really well. I always had in the back of my mind that he could be a step better on the grass, but I'd wanted to keep him on the dirt as long as I could, until finally he was beaten by a really good local horse, and I thought, now it's time, we've got to try the grass. And, it's no secret that I tend to train grass horses. A lot of my horses come to me with grass pedigrees. I always try to get the 2-year-olds going on the dirt. I think it's really important for them to get their early education on the dirt. And, as you get to breezing them, once they get up to sort of a half mile, 5/8 of a mile, I think you really figure out which ones are comfortable on the dirt and which ones are really looking to get on another surface. And at Fair Hill, we have the option of going on a synthetic. Horses that handle synthetic, 9 times out of 10 will handle the grass, is from my experience, which sort of goes to the idea that I think synthetic's a tremendous replacement for when horses come off the grass, when races come off the grass, to use it as an alternative. So it's a little bit trial and error. A lot of it's pedigree. Some of it's guesswork, without a doubt.
Well, from my household's point, I'd like to thank you for the Manhattan. My wife and I were at Belmont, and that was a very, very contentious race. And she said, well, Graham Motion is not going to run a horse in this race if he doesn't think he's got a pretty good chance. So I've forgotten what the odds were, but thank you.
I think he was 20-1, thereabouts. I didn't bet.
Yeah. Well, speaking of turf, I remember some years ago, Leroy Jolly said to me that he wished there were more turf opportunities for 2-year-olds. And in the last few years, there's some more. There's the Breeders' Cup 2-year-old turf race now, and some races that are preps for it, or when you're in. Well, do you have a feeling that, looking back in earlier parts of your career, did you have a frustration that you had a horse that you'd love to try on grass, but there just weren't many 2-year-old races available? And if so, do you think that is significantly improved now?
I think things have changed so much in the last 10 years. I mean, when I first started, we would go to Gulfstream, and I don't believe we ran maidens on the grass at Gulfstream at that time. Nowadays, I think they run maiden claiming, perhaps 20,000 on the grass. I do think we run a risk, with speaking with injuries and such. I think the grass is being used so much these days that it's a surface that cannot take the beating that a dirt course can take. And I do worry that I think the turf races fill very well. Tracks are very keen to run turf races. They get big fields. But turf courses take a beating, and I do think that's detrimental in the long run to the soundness and the safety of the horses. And I think that's a problem that somehow we have to deal with. But aside from that, things have changed significantly, and it actually interests me. I'm always slightly amused that people aren't more looking to go out and buy grass horses early on as yearlings, because there is so much grass racing. There's so much money in grass racing. There's so many more opportunities than there used to be, without a doubt, when I first started.
Just take a beating. Can you be more specific on that?
Turf courses, by running 6 or 7 races perhaps on a day, or by running, when it's rained, and it's a very difficult decision for track management whether they should run on or off and lose the field. So I just think turf courses in general take much more use than they did 10 years ago, and I think it's hard. Some of the tracks, Gulfstream, Maryland, both have many tracks, many different avenues they can use so they can move the rail, which helps protect the course a little bit. But I do think we run the risk of overusing turf courses, and the quality of the turf is not as good as it used to be for that reason.
Well, can you tell us some more about Fair Hill in comparison to stabling on the backstretch of a North American track, and also in comparison to training in Europe, where there's a lot of uphill and downhill, and I think over here we tend to kind of romanticize European training and kind of wish it could be the same over here. But what's the reality of those comparisons?
Well, I think at Fair Hill we're lucky because we do have the options of the different surfaces, which is something that's unique to us. Like I said before, I tend to use a synthetic perhaps more than the dirt. Having said that, we have a very good dirt course to track now that we've renovated. You know, at Fair Hill we have the luxury of we're not preparing the racetrack to race every day, and that's a big luxury. It's less maintenance, it's less wear and tear on the track. We don't keep the dirt track open in the winter because we don't want the wear and tear of the tractors that have to stay on it all night in order for it not to freeze. So again, we're able to protect the surface a little better than a racetrack where they're under the gun to constantly have the track ready for racing in the afternoon. We also have the turf course at Fair Hill, which has a steeplechase race run on it once a year now. It used to be twice. It's a kind of a European-type course where the last quarter of a mile is uphill. The theory behind the uphill being you can get a little more fitness without the horses having to work as fast, perhaps, as they would on a flat track. I've had the opportunity to go to Europe a couple of times now with horses. Miss Temple City, we took over there to Ascot. We took Animal Kingdom. And the biggest problem when I go to Europe is finding a reasonable track to train on. Most of their tracks go up the side of a hill. Some of them almost vertical. To me, it's shocking what they train on. The horses, you know, I do think in Europe the horses have to be that much fitter. They race up and downhill. They race on very soft ground. I think we get away in this country with not having our horses perhaps quite as fit as they do in Europe. So there's a necessity there. But I always find, for me, when I go to Lambourne, which is where I've tended to go instead of Newmarket, the biggest problem I have is finding a relatively flat surface to train on, because when I'm only there for a week or two, the last thing I want to do is start sending my horse up the side of a hill where it's never done that before, and it's starting to use all different muscles that it's never used before. So then you run the risk of making your horse sore, perhaps leading up to the race. So it's been interesting. Having grown up there, I've always loved the thought of being able to go back there with a horse, and it's been fascinating to me to be able to go back and see the training facilities, and they are very lucky. But, you know, we have tremendous training facilities in this country, so I think the mindset has changed a lot. When I first started training, it was practically unheard of for anyone to train in a training center. You had to train on the racetrack. When I started, everyone, you know, said, if you're going to get started, you need to be, I think I was at Laurel or Pimlico at the time, and, you know, you needed to be on the track because nobody knew who you were if you were out at Fair Hill or one of the training centers. But the mindset's changed a lot, and I think that's a good thing. But we're very fortunate at Fair Hill. We have a lot of great facilities.
I've only heard one person say what I'm about to recall, and I was astounded by it then, and I still am. Winfields, when they put in the farm in Maryland, for a while they experimented with training off grass gallops there, and I think Del Carroll had those horses. And Joe Thomas told me that they fairly soon came to the conclusion that the horse not being in the atmosphere of the racetrack was a detriment in terms of him beginning to be more laid back and just not on his toes in his attitude. Again, I've only heard one person ever say that, but it was Winfield's Farms. Have you ever had any experience at Fair Hill where you think, gosh, this horse would be better off if he were in the hubbub and hustle of the racetrack 24 hours a day?
You know, it's something I think about a lot. We had a horse when I worked for Jonathan Shepherd that, you know, Jonathan had a similar system where he trained on the farm and also trained at Delaware on the track. And we had a really good horse, I believe his name was Feligno, who, without a doubt, he was an older horse, he was a colt, he was a stallion. And without a doubt, his most disappointing races were when he trained off the farm, And there was no doubt to me, kind of observing it at the time, when he ran off the racetrack, he was a completely different horse. So I do think there's something to that. The other aspect is that, at Fair Hill, every time we race, we have to ship. So, certainly sometimes for a nervous horse, it's not always the best thing. It's a lot easier. I keep a small string at Belmont because it's a difficult ship to Belmont on the day of the race. So we keep a small group up there so they can get up there the day before if they're racing. And it's a lot easier to walk a horse right out of his stall to the paddock than put him on the van at 5 o'clock in the morning when he has to go 2 or 3 hours to a racetrack. So there are pros and cons in that respect.
Now, one of my favorite horses that you trained is Better Talk Now, who was unusual in so many ways in the modern era, in that he was very, very good, which is not all that unusual in the modern era. But anyway, that he raced so long. Can you sort of talk us through his career, and were there things that you had to overcome with him, and if so, what went into the decision of thinking this horse doesn't need to stop? It's okay to bring him back again. So,
yeah, he was very cantankerous as a horse to train. He was not an easy horse to be around, as much as we all loved him. He was not a horse that once his career was done, anyone particularly wanted to ride him, because he wasn't a very easy horse to ride in his day. I think it was ironic, to get off on a tangent a little bit, that Ramon was riding at the time, Ramon Dominguez, because he had an amazing rapport with the horse, and I give him a lot of credit for figuring the horse out, because he could be very headstrong, he could be very difficult. A lot of his races he only won by, a nose or a neck or a head, because he just got there at the right time, and I think Ramon had a tremendous knack with him, as he did with most horses. He was a horse that we ran till he was 10 years old. I think ultimately he did have a small injury and a soft tissue injury. I think as the horses get older, you do tend to notice, like with people, the soft tissue injuries perhaps become more of a problem. But I don't think I'd ever experienced running a horse to that age, and everyone would say, well, how long are you going to run him? Well, he seemed fine and happy to do it to me. And actually, even in his retirement, he looked like a horse that you could have taken to the track when he was 12 or 13. He never lost his physique. He looked kind of like, I always say to people, he looked like a cross-country runner when he was racing. He was a long-distance runner. He looked like a greyhound. He was always very light-framed. He covered an extraordinary amount of ground with his stride. But even up until 12, 13, he looked like a horse you could lead to the paddock any day. Unfortunately, we lost him last year. He had about a colic. He lived at Fair Hill. I never really wanted to take him out of his routine. He loved being at Fair Hill. He'd been there since he was a 4-year-old, I think, possibly a 3-year-old. And I think he loved the routine. He always had a groom that looked after him. And last year he got a colic, and we had to put him down. But it was a great run with him.
I don't think Ken Ramsey is here, so tell us about the Breeders' Cup when he beat Kitten's Joy. I think that was at Lone Star. Was that any specific memories of that race?
Yes, a lot of memories. The favorite on the day made a very premature move, which really helped us. The European Horse Powers Court, which really helped our cause. Kind of spread out the field. Ramon, as he always did, waited as long as he possibly could, and actually conceivably even made the lead a little too early, because he wandered around a little bit in the stretch. There was a steward's inquiry, which I think probably took 4 or 5 minutes. It felt like 15 at the time. And I'm not sure that we didn't get lucky with the stewards at Texas, were maybe a little more forgiving than they might have been somewhere else. But there was never any doubt in my mind that he shouldn't have come down. Mr. Ramsey might have said something differently at the time. But it was a great memory. He was a horse that really put me on the map. I think when we won the Breeders' Cup, for Ramon and for myself, it was the first time we'd ever probably competed in the Breeders' Cup. I ran 3 horses that day. I remember Filmmaker, who was a filly I had that I liked a lot. We'd had one of our first really good mares. She won the Queen Elizabeth here in another very close finish. But I remember that day, Johnny came back and he was second on Filmmaker, and he looked at me and he said, "What's wrong? Why, you look so disappointed?" And I was like, this was my chance to win a Breeders' Cup today. And later on, Better Talk Now won. He was 27-1 that day, so it was a day I'll never forget.
That's good. One of the things that Grayson Foundation has looked into, and we've had some encouragement and some discouragement, is if there's an advantage to training horses both clockwise and counterclockwise. I'm talking about an advantage of helping maintain soundness. Can you sort of talk about whether you think there are pros and cons to that, and for the pattern of American racing, are there more cons than pros, or vice versa?
Yeah, I do think it's a little bit of a problem that we're constantly training in the same direction. It's just common sense that it puts more stress on certain parts of the body than others. I don't know scientifically, and I can't honestly say that I notice a huge increase in issues because of it, but it just makes sense that it's not ideal to be training in the same direction every day. I think certainly trainers adjust to it, whether it's by jogging the wrong way on some days of the week. At Fair Hill, we have the option where late in the morning, again, because we're not a racetrack, we can actually gallop the wrong way after 11 o'clock, and we usually save a set for the end of the morning to do that with. It's more about horses that are probably a little difficult to train. They just relax better going that way more than the physical reasons. But, horses that when I run a horse that's stabled at Fair Hill, it often won't see a racetrack for almost 10 days after it runs. It'll have 3 or 4 days of just turnout and hand walking, and then it'll probably go in a field and just jog for 3 or 4 days. So it's very unusual for a horse that I run that sees a racetrack for 8 or 10 days after it runs. So it does kind of get a break from that regular routine of always going the wrong way. But I can't say I see a big issue with it, but it's common sense that it does cause probably more problems than it might otherwise.
Speaking of a trainer and soundness, what's your take on the fact that trainers, especially of major horses today, want so much more time between races than before? I'm old enough to remember Hearst Jacobs, whose mantra was, "There's no purse for working out, so why should I work him when I can be racing him?"
Yeah, again, I think we balance a fine line as trainers. I think much more is put into our records, our own personal statistics, whether it's percentages or just wins. So I think we tend to be a little bit more conservative with placing horses. But I also think we probably know a little more nowadays scientifically about how long it takes a horse to recover from a race to be at their optimum. And, often we're pointing for big races. If I want to run a horse in the Breeders' Cup in November, I probably want that to be no more than its 5th or 6th start if I want to get it there in what I feel is its best condition, because I think you run the risk of a horse that runs as hard as those caliber horses do, of them being over the top once you get to the Breeders' Cup. So, a horse like Spring Quality, I would love to think we might get him to the Breeders' Cup at Churchill, but he'll probably only have 2 more races between now and then. He's a lightly raced horse, and I think optimally, if I want him to perform at his very best on those days in $1 million races, I need to give him plenty of time to recover.
Would you think that... do you feel that over the years you have had to... you can only embrace that philosophy because you have learned different things? For instance, I think Mr. Jacobs, with his ilk, would have said, "Gosh, once you get him sound and fit to race, you're protecting his soundness more by racing him more frequently." Clearly, you have come to a conclusion otherwise, but did you have to make a conscious effort to teach yourself how to have a horse at his peak 6 weeks after a race, as opposed to getting him at his peak and keeping him at his peak by frequent racing?
Yeah, I think it's trial and error. I think every trainer might give you a different response to that, whether it's working 5 days out from a race or 6 or 7 days out from a race. whether it's running, in 5 weeks or 4 weeks. So I think it's something that you become comfortable with as a trainer, and I think a lot of it's just from your own experience. I've felt over the years we've been fortunate enough to get to the Breeders' Cup quite a bit, and it's something that I love to point for. I mean, it's an amazing weekend. If I have a horse that's good enough, I want to have it so it can perform its best that week. And in order to do that, I feel like a horse can't be running all year round. At some point, it's got to have had a break, because it's not going to be fresh enough to get there in November, and it's going to need spacing in order to get to those races. So, but I think certain, trainers are all going to have their own feelings about what they're comfortable with, but that's sort of my comfort zone, if you like.
Well, I think we're getting near the end. Let me indulge my personal curiosity. With your background of having been raised in England, I think you were associated with the Grand National winner and so forth. What are some of your favorite memories, your favorite horses, and your favorite races? As long as you're only talking about races that the horses turned out but were sound afterwards, we'll be okay.
You talk about the Grand National. My mom actually looked after a Grand National winner. The last filly or mare that won the Grand National, my mom actually looked after and rode her. She hunted her in the morning, so that's pretty neat. Look, I grew up in racing. I left England when I was 16, but my family were always involved in racing. I knew from a very early age, I always wanted to be a jockey, but I knew I was going to be too big or not brave enough, probably. It was something, as a kid, I really wanted to do. But the next best thing was to be a trainer. I remember growing up watching Henry Cecil on back then we could only really watch horse racing on a Saturday in England. That was when the racing was on TV, and you remember watching trainers like Henry Cecil, Michael Stout saddling horses, and that was something that it just kind of caught my attention, or it caught my imagination. I don't know what it was. It's ironic that however many years later, to be competing with those guys. We beat a filly of Henry Cecil's at Churchill when Sher de Count won the Breeders' Cup, and I kind of had to pinch myself afterwards, that you've come to that level where you've grown up competing with your childhood idols. So I didn't have particular favorites. Tisnow was a favorite of mine. He came back and ran so well in the Breeders' Cup several years in a row. I'm just a fan of racing. Watching Bob Baffert handle Justify this year was amazing. To see the Triple Crown, I've been fortunate enough to be there when both Triple Crown races when it's been done in my generation. So I think I'm a fan of that, and I think as trainers we get into this. Ultimately, we get into the sport because of the love of the horses, or most of us, and I think you just earn a tremendous respect for the horses, and that's what I enjoy doing. Is I enjoy being around the horses in the morning. The bigger you get, the more you get away from that. You get more involved with the business side of it, but ultimately, being at the barn and being around the horses, I feel very lucky to be doing what I'm doing.
Thank you, Kathy. Do we have some questions?
We do. Okay, so the first question, what sort of methods do you employ to help a race-ready foreign import to make the transition to North American dirt racing? What would you do if you didn't have the advantage of the facilities at Fair Hill, but were stabled at a typical racetrack backside?
Yeah, I think my biggest feeling with imports is I'm reluctant to be in a hurry with the imports when they come over. I think they need time to get acclimated. It's very hot over here, especially at this time of year. I'm just reluctant to rush them into a program. I think they need time to adjust. They need time to adjust to our training regimes, to galloping around a racetrack rather than going up the side of a hill. So I think it's, from my own personal preference, I find giving them a little time to get adjusted is what's worked best for me. I think that answers the question. I'm not sure.
Okay. Another, what do you think about wearables to track horse fitness? Do you or have you ever used them?
I'm not sure what that is.
So like the heart monitors or any of the fitness tracking type things? So
I have used them to some degree. We first started using them actually when Animal Kingdom was going to Ascot, because when it was more for me, for my comfort zone. When you go to England, it's, you know, you get away from being able to use your stopwatch, which American trainers can't operate without a stopwatch. We have to have a stopwatch. So we used a heart monitor, which was able to tell me how fast he went each furlong when he was galloping and breezing. I've used them a little bit since then, possibly not as much as I should have, because I think, you know, there is so much more science available, but I do use them a little bit, possibly not as much as I should do.
Okay. To what extent do financial considerations factor into a trainer's decision to stop racing a horse, especially at lower levels? And if it is a significant factor, what can be done to make retiring a horse at the right time financially feasible?
Well, I think it does make it a difficult decision. But ultimately, it's the responsibility you have to the horse, and I think we are so much more aware of it. I think this has come more than anything that we do. I think retirement of horses has become such a prerogative in the last 5 or 6 years for people that I think we're really going in a great direction with it. And I'm sure we don't have a perfect system, but I think we've come a long way. I'm not really sure what other incentives could be out there, but you know, I think the program, the retired horse competition, I've forgotten the name of it, we were talking about it earlier, but the Retired Racehorse Project, I think things like that is such a great incentive for people to find other careers for horses, and there's so many people out there looking for horses to go on to do other things with that I think we're doing really well in that respect. I think things have changed a great deal.
That's all we have from here, unless you have anything else, Ed.
Well, I think that's we're on schedule here, maybe a little bit earlier. Thank you very much, and I really appreciate the effort you've made to fly in and out, and so I hope there's not much traffic between here and the airport. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So our next group has 5 speakers, and while they're going to move the chairs and add 3 more, they've asked me to do a little sing and dance. I'm just kidding. I'm not really going to do that, which is good for you guys. So I will address that wearables question while we do that, because I talked with Michael DeCock when he was here with that horse, Mubtahij, and he said that he uses the wearables only when he's not going to be where the horse is. So these are the monitors they can put on the horses. And so if he's got horses that are traveling abroad, or a horse that's in the United States and he's in Dubai or wherever, he'll have those monitors on his horses that aren't with him, because they give him the sort of feedback, I guess analytically, that he gets with his own eyes if he's there. And so Graham's usually hands-on and doesn't have to do that, but I think it's a good feedback tool if a trainer's not going to be there. Also, I want to thank Graham again for flying in just for this. He flew in this morning, and he's got a horse running in Canada in the Queen's Plate. So he's got to fly home tomorrow, fly to Canada. So thank you again, Graham, for coming.